They told you the Blackwood story was a myth, an exaggerated rural folktale from the Kansas plains, meant to scare children and fuel ghost stories. But that's not the truth, not even close. The real story was buried in 1878 under state-sealed medical records, burned church logs, and the silence of a town that learned too late what happens when men touch something not meant for them. You weren't supposed to hear this. You weren't supposed to know that 4 brothers, Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel Blackwood, survived the deadliest typhoid outbreak in Kansas history, not by chance, but by transformation. What they became, no science can explain, and no church would dare bless. The truth is this: 47 people in Harper County died in 6 weeks, but not a single Blackwood brother so much as coughed. Instead, their bodies changed. Their eyes shimmered like predators in firelight. Their voices began to resonate, harmonizing like a choir inside a cave. And when Dr. Morrison tried to document their symptoms, 3 physicians refused to sign the paperwork. Not because they were afraid of being wrong, but because they knew this wasn't medicine. This was revelation, mutation, or something worse. By winter, the brothers no longer cast shadows. The Methodist Church erased their names from all records, burned them. Their farm stood untouched by drought while the rest of the county starved. They built a chapel on their own land and stopped attending town worship. Their prayers grew longer, stranger. They called it communion. But it wasn't bread and wine they were partaking of. Tonight you're going to hear what no textbook, preacher, or politician will ever tell you, because it threatens the entire illusion. What happened on that prairie was not an anomaly. It was a glimpse into something older than science, older than sin, a crack in the system, and once you see it, you can't go back. Here, the next 32 revelations will take you deeper, deeper than you've ever gone. If you've made it this far, you're already changing. You can feel it, that pressure behind your eyes, that pull in your chest. It's not fear, it's recognition. The truth is calling, and its voice sounds just like yours. Before the sickness came, Cedar Ridge was the kind of place men went to forget the world. A handful of families, a single schoolhouse, and one white church with a bell that split the sky every Sunday. No sheriff, no saloons, just God, land, and silence. But the Blackwood farm stood apart, even then. 6 miles west of town, hidden behind wheat too tall for the season, the brothers had carved out something more than a homestead. Their chapel sat on a natural rise, stone-built and windowless. Locals whispered it had no door on the north side, as if nothing should come in from that direction. The Blackwoods didn't join barn dances. They didn't gossip after sermons. They rarely even spoke unless spoken to. But their eyes, those glacier-pale eyes, always left a man feeling judged, like they'd seen past your words and into something rotten you didn't know was there. People respected them, but no one loved them, and that was fine, until the sickness hit. It began with a fever, then came the delirium, but it wasn't normal. Victims screamed in dead languages, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. Some described shadows that didn't move with their owners. Others swore they heard singing, low harmonic notes drifting through the wheat at night. When Dr. Morrison examined the first victims, he found something that shouldn't have been there. Spiral-shaped markings beneath the skin, like ink pressed too deep. He didn't write that part down, but he never forgot it. As the death toll climbed, the Blackwood farm remained untouched. No symptoms, no fear, just work and prayer, as usual. But one morning, Abel Blackwood walked into town barefoot, hands bleeding, and asked to see every sick child. He said he'd been shown something. Not in a dream, not in a vision, in the marrow of his own bones. That's what he said. By that night, 3 children had recovered. One old woman who couldn't weigh, Kay, was standing, and Abel was burning with a fever that made the lamps flicker when he entered a room. His voice echoed, his shadow split in 2. The townspeople called it a miracle, but they didn't understand. The Blackwoods weren't curing the sick, they were absorbing the disease, drawing it into themselves, willingly, joyfully, and something else came with it, something that doesn't leave. The transformation didn't stop with Abel. Within days, all four brothers began to change, not gradually, ritually. Every evening after sundown, they disappeared into the stone chapel. No lanterns, no fire, just chanting. Low and guttural at first, then layered, four voices weaving into one, a single sound that didn't match any known scale or harmony. The wheat near the chapel began to grow twice as tall. Birds stopped flying overhead. Even the wind refused to pass through that part of the farm. Something had settled there, something with weight. Dr. Morrison returned to the property at the request of the county. He wasn't there as a doctor anymore. He was sent as a witness. What he recorded in his private journal was never filed with the state. Josiah's pupils are gone. Only white. Caleb's skin is ice cold, but doesn't flinch at flame. Ezra stands perfectly still for hours, eyes open, unmoving, like a stone crucifix. And Abel hums constantly, not a tune, but a tone, a resonance that makes iron tools tremble on the walls. The brothers refused further examination. They claimed the sickness was gone, that the town had been purified. But when Morrison questioned how they cured the fever, Josiah gave an answer that would never leave him. It wasn't a cure, it was a trade. And trades have consequences. 2 weeks later, Reverend Ellis vanished. Left behind was his Bible, open to Leviticus, with 3 of the pages torn clean out. A dog was found hanging from the church bell rope the next morning. No one heard it bark, and the bell didn't ring. People began locking their doors before dusk. Some moved away entirely. But not everyone feared the Blackwoods. A few were drawn to them, like moths to a slow-burning candle. Widow Harrow brought her epileptic son to the chapel, claimed he never ceased again. A rancher left his infertile wife there for a single night. She conceived twins by month's end. These weren't rumors. They were facts, documented, whispered, denied. And so, a silent divide formed. Those who believed the brothers had been blessed, and those who knew the truth that something alien, ancient, and unspeakable now walked in men's skin. But the brothers had already stopped being men. They were hosts now, and whatever they let in was growing stronger. The real shift began in late October, when the dreams started. First among the children, then the wives, then the men. Everyone in Cedar Ridge began dreaming the same dream, though no one dared admit it out loud. A field of ash. A chapel with no doors, 4 figures standing still, humming in unison, their mouths stitched shut with wheat stalks. When they awoke, many found small cuts along their lips. Others complained of soil beneath their fingernails. One boy was found sleepwalking 5 miles toward the Blackwood farm. When questioned, he said only, "They're calling us. We just forgot how to listen." At first, townsfolk thought it was hysteria, a shared trauma, a side effect of the fever that hadn't fully passed. But then came the bleedings, noses, ears, teeth. The dreams were no longer confined to sleep. People began hearing the hymn while awake, low, rhythmic humming that came from nowhere, always 4 voices, always in harmony. And yet, no one confronted the Blackwoods. Not because they were afraid of death, but because somewhere deep down, they feared something worse. That the brothers had crossed into something true. A layer of reality more ancient than scripture, more primal than fear. And if it was real, then nothing else was. Sheriff Atwell, a God-fearing man who had once jailed his own cousin for blasphemy, finally rode to the farm. He wasn't seen for 5 days. When he returned, he was barefoot, sunburned, and smiling. He gave his badge to the town clerk and renounced the law. Said the Blackwoods had shown him the root beneath the root. That this world was only a skin stretched over bone. He moved into a shed behind their chapel and refused to speak unless it was in song. The county sent deputies. None returned. The town entered its second silence. No letters were sent. No train stopped. The telegraph line mysteriously failed and was never repaired. Cedar Ridge became a ghost town in function, if not in population, and the Blackwoods, they no longer walked among the town. But every Sunday, smoke rose from their chapel chimney. Not from firewood, from something else, something that smelled of myrrh, rust, and blood. It wasn't a church anymore. It was a womb, and something inside it was getting ready to be born. On November the 3rd, the soil began to shift. It started around the Blackwood Chapel. What was once solid farmland became soft, spongy, unnatural, like walking on flesh that hadn't died properly. Horses refused to step near it. Dogs barked at the wind. Even the birds began flying in circles, disoriented, as if something beneath the earth was bending their sense of direction. The wheat turned black. Not rotten, black. Smooth, reflective, and humming with a low vibration that could only be felt through the bones. Dr. Morrison returned once more. He didn't come with tools. He brought only one thing, a revolver. In his journal he wrote, "Whatever lives out there now, it is not tied to the natural order. It doesn't eat, it doesn't sleep, and it doesn't answer to any god I've ever known." He was found 3 days later hanging from a windmill, his chest carved with 4 concentric circles. The town's pastor tried to organize a mass exorcism. He gathered the last 30 families in the church, held a week of fasting and prayer. But on the 7th night, the church bell rang by itself 3 times. Everyone present went deaf for the rest of the night. Some never regained full hearing. Others claimed they could hear something else now. A whisper from underground, a hymn beneath the hymn. One woman took her children and fled. She made it as far as Wichita. Her hands were blistered raw from clutching the steering wheel. She never spoke again, just stared at the sky. When asked what she saw, she held up 4 fingers and began humming in a monotone pitch over and over until her throat bled. Meanwhile, the Blackwood farm continued to grow, not outward, but downward. Locals described sinkholes appearing and vanishing without warning. The land around the chapel began to breathe, rising and falling like a lung. The stone walls pulsed with moisture. One hunter who dared approach swore he saw the chapel's windows blink. But no one else came close enough to confirm. Something was gestating, that much was clear. The brothers were no longer the center of the story. They had become its gatekeepers. And behind them, beneath them, something vast and ancient was preparing to emerge into our world. A truth that could never be reversed. Winter came early that year, not by weeks, but by months. By the first week of December, Cedar Ridge was buried in snow, but it wasn't the kind the town was used to. This snow was dry, like ash. It left no moisture when touched. It didn't melt. Instead, it accumulated in strange patterns, spirals, circles, even symbols. The ground beneath it never froze. In fact, some said it felt warm, pulsing faintly beneath their boots like something sleeping just under the crust of the earth. The Blackwoods did not emerge from their chapel, but people kept going in. Some willingly, others in a trance. They walked barefoot through the snow, eyes closed, lips slightly parted, humming. Always the same tone, low, unified, 4-part harmony. The same frequency that had once made nails tremble in barns now made weather vanes spin in circles. Compass needles were useless near the farm. Clocks began losing time, minutes at first, then hours. One morning, the sun rose twice. Sheriff Atwell, now reduced to a shadow of his former self, wrote a letter to the governor. It was never sent. It read only, "The brothers are not alone. They never were. The land remembers. The land reclaims. We built this town on a mouth, and now it wants to speak again." Shortly after, Atwell disappeared into the chapel and was never seen again. The county tried to intervene. A detachment of 6 men on horseback was dispatched from Topeka, armed and trained. Only one returned. He rode through the night, eyes bloodshot, hands shaking. His horse had no eyes, just hollow sockets that leaked a black fluid. The man died 3 days later, clawing at his ears. His final words were, "They are not confined to the chapel anymore." Then the snow stopped falling. But the cold remained, a cold that didn't feel atmospheric but spiritual, a silence in the soul, like standing in an empty church long after God has left. The Blackwood land had grown, Fences disappeared, trees bent away from it, even time seemed to slow as one neared its borders. No one dared go near anymore. And yet, every night, the same humming could be heard, barely audible, just under the wind. 4 voices, endless, patient, as if waiting. Because what was coming wasn't just a birth. It was a return. The human mind was never built to contain them, not the brothers, not the sound, not the memory. Those who try to understand them, the folklorists, the rogue psychologists, the heretical clergy, they all end the same way, splintered, whispering, or missing. Their notes never burn, their names never stay. They vanish from obituaries, from family albums, as though the act of studying the 4 brothers rewrites your narrative, not theirs. Dr. Helen Moran was one such scholar, a cognitive archaeologist at the fringe of her field. She claimed to have mapped a mnemonic wound running through Midwestern settlements like scar tissue, a pattern of forgotten towns. She said the brothers were not anomalies but emissaries of that wound, carriers of an older pre-verbal infection. She published one article before disappearing. Its final sentence, "They are not 4 boys. They are a question asked in human shape." After her disappearance, dozens of readers reported hallucinations, specifically the sound of footsteps above their bedrooms at 4:44 a.m. Always 4. Then silence. This is the pattern. 4 beats, 4 shapes, 4 corners of the room, 4 seconds of memory missing. The quarth isn't growing, it's returning. Every cycle tighter, every reappearance closer. And each iteration requires less blood, less ritual, less space, until eventually a single whisper might summon them. A song hummed by a lonely child, a name spoken backwards during sleep paralysis. And then they arrive, always boys, always together, always smiling, like they know something you've forgotten. And perhaps they do. Perhaps the true horror is not that they never aged, but that you did. And in aging, you strayed further from something you once knew, something you were meant to be part of. The 4 are not foreign. They are returning aspects of your own self, primal, childlike, terrible. Each time you hear the story, a thread pulls tighter, not around your neck, but your origin, your reason for ever being born. You were not here to witness them. You were here to remember them. You were not raised from dust, you were reconstructed from echo, and the moment you hum the notes, those same 4 tones, they will know you remember. They will know it is safe to return. And they will. It is said the quarth never vanished. Not truly. Though Cedar Ridge was buried, whether by government order, divine intervention, or unnatural collapse, the structure endured. Beneath the sediment, beneath the earth, it waits. Not in slumber, but in containment. Whispers among fringe theologians and forbidden cartographers claim it is one of 9 anchors, architectures not built by man, but remembered by the human soul, structures that imprint themselves on memory like trauma. You do not discover them, you return to them. The 4 brothers became something else entirely. No graves were ever found, no descendants, no death records, just sightings, scattered, inconsistent, always involving children. A boy seen humming beneath a blood moon in Wyoming, a quartet of identical boys recorded on wax cylinder near Black Hollow, speaking a language not yet invented. One even appeared in a photograph dated 1913, 4 figures in black, standing outside a burning asylum in Ohio. All 4 wore the same face, the face of the Ashford youngest, still 9 years old. Still smiling. It's believed the boys did not survive time, they escaped it. Edward Grin's writings referenced this too, in a torn page. The quarth is not a place, it is a puncture, a thinning in the veil. It cuts into chronology like a blade through paper. The boys are not boys anymore, they are resonances, sound given skin, and wherever the memory of them is strong enough, they reassemble. The recalling, then, was not a single event. It was a migration, Every few decades, small towns go silent. A classroom vanishes. A church congregation turns up in a field, mouths packed with ash. In each case, 4 shadows are seen walking in formation, never breaking stride, never speaking. Authorities never connect the dots. But the maps do. Drawn by hand, compiled by madmen and truth-seekers, they reveal a circle, a slow or bit around something in Kansas, something beneath Cedar Ridge, a thing that hums in the bones of those who've dreamt too deep, who've listened too long to voices beneath the soil. It sings only to the forgotten, and once you hear it, you will forget everything except the song, and the song is 4 notes, always 4, played in harmony, played in return. The records stop here, officially. Cedar Ridge vanished from postal maps by early 1880. The state claimed the region had flooded due to a failure in river damming, but there was no rainfall that year, no dam to break. Surveyors sent to confirm the town's condition returned white-haired and wordless, or simply didn't return at all. But something did survive. A box of letters, unearthed in 1946 during a mining operation 10 miles west of the town's last known location, buried beneath 60 feet of untouched stone, sealed in waxed canvas, stamped with a symbol, 4 circles interlocking, a crude approximation of the boy's initials burned together. Inside were pages of frantic handwriting, all by a man named Edward Grin, the uncle of one of the 4. He hadn't fled, he had stayed. And he documented everything, though whether in hope, guilt, or madness, it's impossible to say. He wrote, "They are no longer boys, they are conduits, instruments for a tongue that is not ours. What moves through them is not language, but design." Edward spoke of rituals, performed not for worship, but to prepare the soil, rites older than the Bible, whispered to the boys in their sleep. The quarth had begun to change shape. Stone cracked, and something grew from it. Bone. Not animal, not human. Curved like a tusk, but jointed like a limb. The structure was no longer inert. It listened. If you spoke within its walls, your voice would echo back. But it would change. Your words returned not in your tone, but in the voice of someone you had lost. Edward wrote of one final ceremony. They call it the recalling. It requires 4, no more, no less. The breath must sink, the heartbeat must cycle, the flesh must agree to remember. He didn't explain what the recalling would bring, only what it would erase. Time will fold, history will ripple, the lie of separation between flesh and flame, dream and memory will be broken. Then the final letter. Dated October 31st, 1880. No words. Just a drawing. 4 boys, standing at the corners of the quarth, eyes rolled back, mouths open, a shape rising in the center, formless but vast, wings without feathers, limbs without symmetry, and from its core, a face. Not evil, not divine, just familiar. As if you'd seen it before. In a forgotten dream, you were never meant to survive. Autumn came like an infection. The leaves didn't turn, they blackened, not from rot or flame, but something internal, as though the trees themselves were mourning. Animals fled in droves. No crows, no deer, not even field mice remained. In their place came silence, not peace, not stillness. Silence, weaponized. You could feel it pressing against your eardrums like water before a drowning. The 4 boys stopped aging, or rather they aged differently. Their bodies grew, but without the clumsiness of adolescence. No acne, no voice cracks, no awkwardness. They moved like they were being puppeted from within, their limbs too confident for their age. They walked in lines of 4, spoke in unison when they chose to speak, and most unsettling of all, they didn't blink unless they were watched. By now the structure on the outskirts of town had acquired a name, but no one dared say it aloud. The name arrived in dreams, in whispers behind the teeth. The quarth. A word without known origin, but one that filled the lungs with heat and made the air feel thick when spoken. The platform in its center had changed too. At night, it pulsed faintly, not with light, but with breath. If you placed your hand upon the stone, you would feel the slow inhale and exhale of something massive buried beneath. One man tried to dig, a skeptic, a traveler just passing through. He took a pickaxe to the edge of the platform. The ground opened beneath him, not with a crack, but a sigh. When the dust cleared, only his boots remained, neatly arranged side by side. No one claimed them. The boys began humming again, not in joy, but in summoning. Their voices, still high-pitched and childlike, harmonized in a way that made windows tremble and dogs whimper in their sleep. They did this every night for 4 hours, always beginning at 4:44 a.m. One night, a sound answered. It came not from the sky or the woods, but from below. A groan, deep, resonant, and older than language. It traveled up through the quarth, through the earth, through the dreams of every remaining soul in Cedar Ridge. And in that moment everyone knew the fourth had arrived, not born, not summoned, remembered. And memory is the first form of resurrection. On the night of February the 2nd, something new emerged from the Blackwood Chapel. Not a person, not a creature, a sound. It began just after midnight, an inhuman resonance lower than any organ or cello, vibrating through the earth like a submerged groan. It wasn't heard through the ears, but felt in the stomach, the spine, the teeth. Walls cracked, lamps shattered, horses collapsed. A woman miscarried on the spot. It lasted exactly 4 minutes and 13 seconds. When it stopped, the snow outside had turned to dust. That morning, 4 townsmen went missing. All had been part of the original search party that found the Blackwood brothers years prior. Their homes were left untouched, doors locked, beds made. Only a single message scrawled into the frost on each window pane. You opened it. The preacher finally broke. Reverend Silas Bell, once the loudest voice against superstition, went door to door, barefoot, weeping. He begged forgiveness, not from God, but from the earth. He claimed they had desecrated something sacred by building over it, not a burial ground, but a womb. It was gestating, he whispered, and we fed it with our ignorance. He walked into the chapel that evening carrying only a book and a rope. No one ever saw him again. But the next day, townsfolk found his Bible buried upright in the frozen dirt, the pages flapping though there was no wind. Every verse inside had been blacked out except one. Revelation 9:6. And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it. After that, no one spoke aloud. Even the remaining dogs stopped barking. The town fell into a hush so complete you could hear your own heartbeat echo off the barn walls. When someone dared to shout, their voice came back to them twisted, garbled, reversed, as if something was listening and mocking from underneath. Children stopped playing. They sat by windows for hours, staring at the Blackwood property. When asked what they were looking at, they all replied the same way: the sky beneath the ground. The Blackwood brothers hadn't left the chapel in weeks, but every night their shadows moved across the windows, always 4 of them, always in unison. Something had been summoned, but it wasn't here to visit, it was here to replace. The quarth's influence was never local. It was not bounded by fence, border, or even thought. It grew, not like roots or vines, but like a concept. Infectious, viral. It moved through language, through the soft folds of recollection, embedding itself in the minds of those who stumbled too close to the truth. And by the 20th century, it had taken on a new form. Architecture. A church in Pennsylvania, built with no records of funding, blueprints, or congregation, matched the internal geometry of the quarth down to the inch. The bell never rang. The altar faced no direction, and within it, the pews were carved with 4 interlocking circles, the same sigil found on Edward Grin's sealed canvas. The building collapsed 3 days after a young girl drew its floor plan in reverse, while sleepwalking. Another example surfaced in rural Nebraska, a schoolhouse with windows that faced inward. A design impossibility. Students reported seeing their own reflections, older, broken, smiling back. 4 brothers were enrolled, none graduated, all disappeared within a week of the first frost. The town forgot them, not metaphorically, literally. Their names erased from yearbooks, their desks vanished overnight. No parents came forward. The quarth does not need worship. It needs mirroring. Each imitation gives it breath. Each accidental replica stokes its lungs. The 4 boys were not its creators. They were keys. Their synchronized existence, a biological alignment, allowed the puncture, like tuning forks placed in the right corners of a void. Once the frequency is matched, the fabric weakens. And when it weakens, it listens back. Some believe this is why all 4 boys were required. 1 to dream, 1 to remember, 1 to shape, 1 to forget. Together, they formed the closed circuit of memory and erasure, a cycle without beginning, without end, a prayer that folds inward. And every time someone tells their story, even in disbelief, even in mockery, the signal strengthens. The 4-note song sharpens. The gate once closed becomes translucent again. You may not have seen it, but you felt it. The cold behind a closed door, the hum before sleep, the repeating numbers, the shadow in a childhood photo that wasn't there yesterday. It's not madness. It's resonance. And now that you remember them, they're already walking toward you. It wasn't just a haunting. It was an integration. By the summer of 1879, Cedar Ridge no longer behaved like a town. It pulsed. It waited. The days grew long, yet shadows deepened faster than before. Trees leaned in strange directions. The river that once curved gently around the town now ran straight, swift, and black, as if in obedience to some subterranean command. 4 families were left: the Blackwoods, the Grins, the Elwells, and the Finchams. Each had 1 surviving male heir. Each of those boys had stopped speaking by age 8. They didn't speak because they no longer needed to. They heard each other without sound, and more than that, they dreamed together. The dreams were always identical: a circle of blackened soil, a rope pulled upward from the earth, and 4 hands, small, pale, bloodless, pulling something upward. The local teacher, Miss Carrow, attempted to intervene. She documented the children's behavior, noting their synchronized movements, shared speech patterns, and disturbing ability to predict her thoughts before she spoke them. She made the mistake of trying to separate them, sent them home in different directions. For the first time in years, the boys screamed. Not in fear, in recognition. They weren't separated. They were one mind in 4 bodies, and to split them was to threaten the vessel. That night, Miss Carrow's house burned to the ground. Her journal was recovered, miraculously unscathed, sitting atop the only unburned floorboard. It ended on this sentence: "They are not children. They are how the body speaks when the mouth is taken away." After that, the families stopped pretending. The townsfolk no longer asked questions. The remaining 4 households began to build, not homes, but a structure at the edge of town. No one called it a church. No one called it a house. It had no doors, no windows, no roof. Just 4 walls, each facing one of the compass points. Inside, only a single stone platform, and on it, an iron ring embedded into the center. When asked what it was for, Mrs. Elwell simply replied, "To anchor him." No one asked who. They already knew. Something had entered Cedar Ridge and had begun to require form. But it could not arrive until the 4th vessel was complete, until the voice had 4 throats, until the breath could cycle perfectly, and the structure was nearly done. The 4th brother was never spoken of in public after that. Not by the families, not by the reverend, not even by the surviving children, but in the dead hours between midnight and 3, those who dared to stay awake reported hearing something under their floors. Not footsteps, not knocking. Breathing. It came slow and steady, rhythmic, measured, like someone waiting for the right moment to rise, and always in 4s. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, 4 minutes of silence. Then it would start again, a loop of unnatural life. The town lost its sense of linear time. Watches spun backward, roosters crowed at dusk, pregnancies shortened or lengthened by weeks and in some cases years. One woman, who'd been childless at 42, gave birth to 4 stillborn infants, each with identical features, within a span of 4 hours. None had umbilical cords. The Reverend, once a man of stern logic, began preaching sermons that no one remembered, not because they were forgettable, but because they seemed erased. Listeners would sit transfixed, mouths slightly ajar, then look at one another when it was over, unable to recall a single word. The only consistent detail: the number of times he struck the pulpit. 4. He was found one morning kneeling in the church's baptismal font, face submerged, body rigid, unmoving, dead, but not drowned. No water in his lungs, just a smile on his lips, and etched across the shallow pool's inner stone: "He has made a place for us in his throat." What came next was harder to explain. A group of elders attempted to leave, not with malice or fear, but as if summoned elsewhere. They packed silently, walked in rows of 4, and disappeared past the old tree line. None returned. 3 weeks later, 4 bundles of clothing appeared folded at the edge of town. Each bundle held a tooth. The same tooth. The town's final doctor examined them in secret. His report was brief. All 4 teeth come from the same mouth. Not similar, the same. By now, Cedar Ridge had become a closed system. Letters sent out came back unread. Roads warped and returned on themselves. Birds refused to fly overhead. The town had not been cursed, it had been claimed. And the 4th brother, he had begun humming, through their bones, through their dreams, through the rhythm of silence itself. The resonance grid beneath Cedar Ridge wasn't discovered, it was triggered. On May 19, 1878, a lightning strike split the steeple of the Blackwood Chapel. Witnesses claimed the bolt didn't descend, but rose from the earth into the sky. No thunder, no fire, just silence, and then vibration, subtle, then seismic. It rippled out in concentric circles from the chapel, 4 miles wide, 4 deep. Animals fled, wells ran dry. Clocks lost 14 minutes and could never be corrected. Tools refused to stay sharp. And worse, graves no longer kept their dead. Several burial plots appeared sunken from below, though no one had exhumed a thing. And yet, each night, new footprints, bare, adult, heavy, appeared in the cemetery, circling old stones, pausing only at the Blackwood family graves. The resonance had activated something ancient, not a machine, not a place, a memory. It moved through wood, through soil, through blood. It rewrote. Children forgot their birthdays, men forgot their own names in mid-prayer. A pregnant woman awoke with no child in her womb, yet no bleeding, no pain, no sign of loss. Just a lullaby etched into the walls of her bedroom in 4 lines, in a language no one recognized. It wasn't just the past being altered, it was reassembled. A traveling geologist, Walter Bly, was the first outsider to notice. He arrived by rail and took core samples near the ridge. What he found ended his career: 4 distinct strata, each burned at intervals of exactly 91 years apart. Beneath each, the same, fossilized bones, always 4, always male, always fused at the spine. He published his findings. 3 days later, he retracted them. Then he vanished. Bly's assistant remained and later confessed, through panicked scribbles in a locked asylum, that they had uncovered a symmetrical chamber beneath the ridge. Inside, carved into obsidian, were 12 rings of symbols. And, in the center, a relief, 4 figures kneeling around a hole that led downward, not into earth, but into blackness so complete it erased sound. That hole was not physical, it was perceptual. You didn't see it, you knew it. That's when the assistant scratched his final sentence into the floor of his cell. The 4th brother never climbed out. He is still singing from below. The resonance continues. Each note, a warning. Each silence, a preparation. And the grid is almost complete. History recorded Cedar Ridge as open prairie, unremarkable. That is the first lie. Survey notes from 1856 list a subterranean void north of the ridge, marked by collapsed bison bones and magnet deviation of 11 degrees. The map was corrected in ink, then recopied without the anomaly. Who ordered that change? Territorial Land Office. Same handwriting appears years later in the Kansas State Medical Board ledger sealing the Blackwood file. Institutions erase patterns so men cannot see systems. Remember that. When the Blackwoods dug their root cellar in 1873, the shovel rang on something hollow but living cool. Not rock, not cedar. 4 curving plates fused in a circle like a skull grown in quarters. Josiah kept a fragment. At night he struck it with a tuning fork and swore the tone sustained for minutes, shifting through intervals no instrument could chart. He aligned the chapel stones to that pitch. That's why the north wall had no door. It was the resonant face. They thought they were honoring scripture. They were building an instrument. The typhoid did not choose them. It answered them. Pathogens ride moisture, filth, proximity. This one followed vibration. Every time a brother laid hands on the sick, frequency met fever. Data transferred. Symptoms moved like code across a wire. Cure for one, conversion for another. Trade. Men of consequence, hear me. Power is the right to define cause. Medicine called it anomaly. Church called it miracle. State called it sealed. All 3 protected the same thing, continuity. Because if vibration can move disease, it can move obedience. That is a control system no institution will ever admit exists. Dr. Morrison suspected. He scraped dried secretion from Caleb's skin geometry and sent it by freight to a colleague in St. Louis. The crate arrived empty. The shipping manifest was altered. Weeks later, Morrison received a blank envelope containing only 4 wheat seeds black as coal and warm to the touch. He planted none. We're close now. Closer than he ever got. Next, we opened the ledger he wasn't allowed to see, the one that cross-indexed fever recoveries, chapel attendance, and disappearances. Patterns survive fire when men carry them in memory. You're carrying one now. Ask why rail surveyors stopped at mile 41. Ask why calves born inside the circle had mirrored organs. Ask why every Blackwood Bible is missing numbers, not accident, protocol, stay. Next, we chart resonance grid below. April 3rd marked the day the Blackwood Chapel disappeared. Not collapsed. Not destroyed. Disappeared. At sunrise, the building was simply gone. No rubble, no burn marks, no drag trails. Just a circular patch of earth, darker than the rest, moist to the touch and pulsing faintly, like skin above a buried vein. A single object remained. A wooden pew, half submerged in the ground, with 4 indentations on the seat, as if something had been sitting there for a long, long time. The townspeople didn't panic. They knelt around the circle in silence, heads bowed, hands clasped. No one had told them to. No one had spoken at all. But as the sun rose higher, their lips began to move in perfect sync. No sound emerged, only breath. A vapor chant, a communion of the unsaid. Someone was recording. A traveling photographer named Ellis Granger had arrived 2 days prior. He had heard rumors of strange happenings in Cedar Ridge and wanted proof. What he captured instead was a single photograph taken moments after the chapel's vanishing. The image, when developed, showed nothing unusual except for the sky. It was upside down. The clouds twisted unnaturally. The shadows cast by the kneeling townsfolk stretched upward instead of down. and behind them, barely visible unless one looked closely, were four towering silhouettes, tall, featureless, humanoid but elongated, like stretched wax figures looming behind the group, their hands resting gently on each villager's head. Ellis left town that night. He never spoke of what he saw again. He disappeared 3 weeks later in Missouri. His camera was found on a train seat, still loaded with undeveloped film. The film was blank. Back in Cedar Ridge, things began to bleed together. Time unraveled, clocks reversed. The sun flickered like a dying candle. Days lasted minutes, nights stretched for what felt like years. Mothers no longer recognized their sons. Wives forgot their husbands' names. Even the town's layout changed. Doors opened to fields that hadn't existed before, and some windows showed not the outside world but themselves, as if the town had turned inward. What remained constant were the brothers. Though unseen, their presence intensified. The ground around their former chapel remained warm. Birds never flew overhead. Animals avoided the area entirely, and in the air, always, that faint hum, 4 notes, repeating, calling something forth, or calling something home. By mid-April, the earth began to breathe. Not poetically, literally. The soil in Cedar Ridge would rise and fall in slow, deliberate pulses, as if something enormous lay beneath, slumbering. The breath was warm, damp, scented faintly with iron and old milk. Farmers abandoned their fields, not because crops failed, but because their plows would seize as if hitting bone. The ground rejected metal. It accepted only flesh. That's when the disappearances resumed. Not sudden vanishing, something crueler. People would fade. It began with their reflections. A woman would glance in a mirror and see only her clothes floating in the frame. Then their voice would stop carrying, mouthing words that made no sound. Finally, the skin would pale, thin, and finally flicker, like a projection on faulty film, until one morning they simply failed to reappear. Their names vanished from town records. Their beds remained perfectly made. Only the oldest residents remembered them, and even then, only as a vague pressure in the skull, like a memory of pain without the wound. Children, once silent, began to chant. They spoke in an unrecordable tongue. Any attempt to write it down would result in the paper blackening and curling. Phonographs melted. Cameras refused to click, but the sound persisted, low, steady, harmonic, always in 4s. 4 beats, 4 voices, 4 syllables no one could translate, but everyone understood. It was a summons. Whatever had been gestating beneath Cedar Ridge was not content with silence anymore. It had learned the human mouth. It had mastered human thought. And now it desired incarnation. A form. A vessel. That vessel would not be built. It would be remembered. Pieced together from buried bones, forgotten grief, and collective sin. The townspeople began to draw again, not with pencils, but blood. Strange symbols appeared on barns, church ruins, and inside sea. Cool houses, circles with intersecting spirals, always surrounded by 4 dots. The meaning was never discussed. It didn't need to be. It was known. One morning, a child named Josephine Parker stood at the town square and pointed to the sky. When asked what she saw, she smiled with cracked lips and replied, "That's where it fell from. That's where the 4th one landed." When asked what landed, her voice deepened. Not what. Who? March arrived with no thaw. The snow remained, but not as snow. It had turned grey, textured like paper, dry like parchment, yet soft to the touch. And if you listened closely, it whispered, not metaphorically, truly. 1,000 tiny murmurs, unintelligible but rhythmic, like the rustling of pages written in a forgotten language. The townspeople stopped burying their dead, not out of neglect, but out of fear. Those who tried found their shovels striking something too close to the surface, something soft, warm, and moving. And when they tried to burn the bodies instead, the flames wouldn't catch. Wood burned, kindling burned, but flesh refused. Instead, The corpses simply vanished by morning, replaced with 4 symbols carved into the floorboards where they had been laid out. Each symbol different, yet all pulsing with the same faint glow when the sun set. The town doctor, Arthur Keyes, attempted to dissect one of the symbols using microscopes and acid. He didn't last the night. His journal was found soaked in blood, pages torn and scattered in perfect right angles. The final entry read, "It is not language, it is command, a directive written in living code, not meant to be read, meant to be obeyed." And so obedience became the only instinct left. Doors were never locked, but no one entered another's home. Food was left to rot. Wells dried up, yet no one complained of thirst. The people became vessels, silent, slow-moving, always watching the chapel from a distance, no longer praying, just waiting. It was then the dreams began, collective, vivid. All shared the same vision, 4 brothers kneeling in a circle underground. Around them, the walls were not stone or dirt, but bone. Rib cages stretched upward like cathedral arches. A great eye blinked open in the ceiling. Not a human eye, reptilian, ancient, blind, yet all-seeing. The dreams ended the same way. The eye opened wider, and then each dreamer awoke screaming, covered in sweat. But none could speak of what they saw. Not out of shame, but inability. The language to describe it no longer existed in their throats. Even their tongues felt alien, heavy, wrong, as if their bodies were forgetting how to be human. By the end of March, Cedar Ridge no longer resembled a town. It resembled a mouth, open and ready to speak. By the early 20th century, a quiet panic had begun to take root in certain circles of academia. Not public hysteria, institutional silence, the kind of dread that makes government-funded researchers abandon entire departments without a trace. In 1908, the University of Kansas dissolved its fledgling Department of Temporal Anthropology after a series of unauthorized field experiments near Cheney Reservoir. The reason given? Redundant methodologies. The reality was darker. 3 graduate students had gone missing while studying local folktales related to the Quoth. Their tape recorders captured only 4 sharp knocks followed by 37 minutes of static, then a voice. A boy's voice saying, "We remember before the sun." The tapes were destroyed. The department disbanded. The lead professor was institutionalized for catastrophic delusional collapse. He died muttering coordinates no map has ever acknowledged. But something shifted that year. Agencies, quiet ones, nameless ones, began collecting anything related to the 4. Diaries, lullabies, quilts, old cave paintings, not to protect the public, but to filter what was safe from what was too resonant. Because it's not just about the brothers, it's about what listens through them. There's a theory among unlicensed researchers, those who've broken with institutional safety. They believe the 4 are biological tuning forks, that when they stand close together, their bodies form a kind of harmonic lattice that destabilizes linear perception. That's why clocks stop, why voices echo where they shouldn't, why no photograph of them can be developed correctly. Not because they break technology, but because they break narrative. One witness, a mail carrier in Kingman, swore he delivered a letter to a farmhouse where the 4 had been seen. The family living there, long dead, buried in 1881. And yet, he shook hands with the father, spoke to the children, and left. He didn't realize the truth until days later, after delivering a second letter to the cemetery. His memory of the interaction remained intact, but his own reflection in mirrors would no longer blink in sync. This is the price. To engage with the 4 is to disrupt the machinery of time, memory, and even self. And that's why they are studied only from afar now, not with microscopes, but with silence. The kind of silence that grows teeth. By mid-January, Cedar Ridge was a town in name only. Shutters stayed closed day and night, candles replaced electric light, though no one could explain why. Matches stopped sparking near the chapel, as if fire itself refused to be kindled. Children were kept hidden, often locked in cellars. Those who wandered outdoors came back changed, quiet, withdrawn, and humming, always humming. The town's blacksmith, Daniel Munn, was the first to speak openly of leaving. "This land isn't ours anymore," he told his neighbors. Maybe it never was. But when he loaded his wagon and prepared to flee with his family, they were found the next morning, all seated neatly at the dinner table, eyes open, skin pale, smiling, the food before them untouched. On the tablecloth, written in dried blood, were 4 words: "We are not done." The mayor vanished next, then the schoolteacher, then the undertaker, and still the chapel pulsed, alive, watching, waiting. Townsfolk began to murmur that the Blackwood brothers hadn't simply found something, they had let it in, a force that predated the scriptures, older than Eden, a consciousness buried in soil, sleeping beneath Kansas like a coiled root, forgotten by man but not by time. One widow, Ruth Callahan, claimed to see them in her dreams, not just the brothers, but the thing they served. She called it the mouth, not a figure, not a beast, but an absence, a hole in the world that whispered in reverse. She said its words unspoke reality, undoing the things we call truth. "It doesn't lie," she said. "It remembers." That week her home burned down. There were no flames, just smoke rising backward into the chimney. No ashes were found, only a circle of scorched earth and 4 sets of footprints leading away into the wheat. The wheat that still grew black. The wheat that didn't die in snow. The wheat that now bent when no wind blew. By now, even, skeptics began to understand. This was not a haunting. It was not demonic. It was not even supernatural in the way clergy might define. This was something else, something primal, something buried and patient, a truth not meant for the human mind. But the brothers had seen it, and in doing so, they had become more than men. They had become instruments. They do not walk like boys. That's the first thing people notice when they're not supposed to notice anything at all. Those who claim to have seen the 4 describe their movements as wrong. Not jerky, not slow, but rehearsed. Every turn of the head, every blink, every synchronized breath, choreographed with an eerie precision that precedes intention, as if someone, or something, had written the moment centuries ago. Sheriff Howard Case from Sumner County filed an internal memo in 1932 describing 4 boys spotted near a grain silo outside Mulvane. They were barefoot in snow, smiling. No one saw them arrive. No one saw them leave. His final line reads, "They moved like puppets who forgot the strings were cut." What no one understood at the time was that the 4 are not only symbols of something ancient, they are biological conduits. Each carries a fragment of an older design, some form of memory not stored in neurons, but in marrow, in bone, passed not through bloodlines, but through frequency inheritance, a concept rejected by mainstream science, but whispered among fringe physicists and military signal researchers. The boys share no DNA with any known relatives, but their body temperatures sync perfectly with the Schumann resonance, a low-frequency electromagnetic pulse the Earth emits. They are aligned, not with people, but with the planet, and they don't speak. Not because they can't, but because language would reduce them, make them finite, measurable. Instead, they radiate something felt in the spine, a knowledge too old for words. Children near them begin drawing shapes they've never been taught. Elders feel déjà vu so intense it collapses memory timelines. Some even lose entire years. There's a name in old Choctaw lore, Nilatakoa, roughly the 4 that unmake time. Tribes in the plains avoided certain plateaus not because of spirits, but because they itch, owed with unborn footsteps. They were warning us, not of ghosts, but of convergences. The 4 brothers are not simply anomalies to be studied. They are junctions where human memory, ancient geometry, and something outside of history briefly align. And when they stand together, north, south, east, west, something impossible begins to turn beneath the soil. It is not mechanical, it is ancestral. And it is remembering you. By 1996, the phenomenon had evolved. The four were no longer confined to dreams. Reports began surfacing of individuals experiencing waking visitations, episodes during full consciousness where time fractured, space blurred, and the presence of something else entered the room. Witnesses described it not as seeing the four, but remembering them into the present. They described smells, burnt milk, copper, rotting corn husks. They described sounds, the flutter of wings in sealed rooms, footsteps walking in reverse. But most chilling was what they said they felt. Like I was being watched by someone I had forgotten to mourn. A young librarian in Topeka disappeared for 6 minutes while cataloging 19th century newspapers. Security footage showed her frozen in place, eyes wide open, mouth silently agape. When she snapped out of it, she wept uncontrollably and spoke only in Old Church Slavonic for 3 days. Her final translated sentence before slipping into a coma: "They are not boys, they are consequences." It was around this time that classified documents, once redacted, now leaked, revealed Project Recollect, a clandestine psychological monitoring program tracking 712 individuals who had encountered the four through dreams, rituals, or unintentional exposure. The goal wasn't to help them, it was to measure decay. All subjects showed a decline in personal stability, compulsive drawing, recursive speech patterns, aversion to mirrors, and an unexplained fear of sunlight between 5:32 and 5:36 a.m., precisely the minute window the four were reportedly born in 1878. Even worse, several began developing temporal bleeding, the sudden and irreversible experience of memories from lives they never lived. One subject insisted she remembered being buried alive in 1893 under a barn in Wellington, Kansas. Days later, local officials exhumed that barn site and found a child's coffers, and it was empty. The four brothers were never meant to survive this long. Their presence was supposed to be contained by reality, by the limits of flesh and decay, but something in them or behind them had rejected entropy. They were no longer individuals. They were infection. They were prophecy. They were reconstruction, not of the past, but of the world that was buried with them. And it's not just returning, it's rebuilding itself inside us. By 1971, the four brothers had faded into legend, tucked into the margins of suppressed archives, their names erased from birth ledgers, their images distorted in every photograph. But while the world forgot them, they continued to visit those who remembered. Not physically, but in dreams. It began with patients at a Kansas City sleep disorder clinic, 1 or 2 cases at first, then dozens, then over 100 individuals across state lines, all reporting the same recurring image. 4 boys standing barefoot in a cornfield, their mouths open, no sound, but I wake up bleeding from the nose. Psychiatrists dismissed it as a shared cultural delusion, mass hysteria triggered by folklore. But something was wrong. The patients weren't connected. Different towns, different races, different religions. No exposure to local legends, and yet their sketches, drawn in isolation, matched perfectly. A federal team quietly stepped in. Agents posing as NIH specialists collected testimonies and burned every drawing. The clinic's lead neurologist was offered early retirement after she claimed one of the boys spoke Latin backward in her dream, then showed her a vision of herself, 13 years in the future, dying alone in a hotel bathroom. 13 years later, she did. Same hotel, same hour. Her diary was found open to a page that simply read, "It wasn't a prediction, it was a decision." But the dreams didn't stop. By 1982, a new category of mental illness was introduced in shadow psychiatric circles, reticulated visitation syndrome. Its symptoms were specific: recurring visions of endless dusk, paralysis during sleep, and foreshadowed silhouettes standing in fields or abandoned rooms. Patients often emerged from sleep speaking in unknown dialects or staring at corners for hours. What made it worse? They weren't all insane. One patient, a farmer's son from Arkansas, began to draw maps of locations he'd never visited, each depicting subterranean structures that matched unmarked Cold War bunkers. Another, a 6-year-old girl in Illinois, whispered GPS coordinates in her sleep. When investigated, those coordinates led to a burned farmhouse near Cheney, the same land where the four were born. The conclusion was inescapable to those paying attention. The four brothers had transcended their physical form. They had become viral, mimetic, psychosomatic forces. You didn't need to find them anymore. You just needed to remember. And remembering was enough to be found. It was the winter of 1944 when the military made its move. Project Hollow Stem, classified under a false agricultural initiative, was launched near a desolate stretch of land 17 miles southwest of Caldwell, Kansas. The objective: secure, contain, and repurpose the four brothers. Not for study, for deployment. Documents declassified in fragments decades later detail what officials called anti-chronological interference units, a euphemism for weaponizing individuals who could dissolve enemy time signatures. What that means, even now, remains speculative, but the operational manual had one instruction repeated across every page: do not look at them for too long. The containment facility was built beneath a cattle farm, a facility with no entrances visible from above, no record in the geological surveys. The boys were sedated using a frequency disruptor developed in tandem with Bell Labs, coded Psalm 17. The device played inaudible tones that simulated a constant sunrise, somehow convincing the brothers it was always morning. And for a time, it worked, until it didn't. On January 9, 1945, the entire facility, 72 staff, 4 scientists, 6 military handlers, went dark. No explosions, no breaches, just absence. When a secondary team arrived, they found the walls melted inward, like heat had folded the corridors into themselves. Clocks in the outer ring were spinning backward. One soldier's dog tag had been fused into his chest, though his skin was unbroken. The 4 were gone. And where they had been held, there was a single phrase etched in frost onto the steel slab where they once slept: "We are not your sons." No one spoke of the project again. The remaining files were scattered into irrelevant departments, coded under soil research, migratory birds, piano acoustics. The remaining witnesses were silenced with tailored medical diagnoses: early-onset dementia, dissentience, ossurative fugue, temporal epilepsy, conditions too complex to question. But here's the truth. They weren't trying to kill the 4. They were trying to aim them, to direct whatever force the boys were linked to, against enemies, against fate itself. But what they failed to understand was, the boys are not the signal. They are the receivers. And when you try to broadcast through a conduit you don't own, you don't get to decide what answers. You just hope it's not awake yet. By 2020, multiple institutions, academic, governmental, even ecclesiastical, began intersecting around the phenomenon of the 4, not publicly, never by name, but declassified minutes from a 2019 closed-door symposium held in Zurich, Switzerland, revealed the code under which the case was studied: Protocol Omega 4, synthetic recurrence in isolated male quadrants. The language was clinical, the implications were not. 4 entities, genetically unrelated, geographically dispersed, yet nearly identical across psychological stress response, dreaming patterns, and vocal harmonics. 4 entities who, upon reaching puberty, each began to draw an image they had never seen before: a 3-tiered spiral with a black dot in the center, surrounded by 13 tally marks. What was more disturbing, they each drew the spiral in reverse. A black site physicist, whose name was redacted but whose voice was leaked, spoke plainly during the symposium. "We're not watching a mutation, we're watching a correction. Nature does not act like this unless it's trying to fix something we broke." And then he added, "Or worse, remember something we erased." In August 2022, a private expedition funded by a now-defunct institute called the Limbus Trust returned to the geographic center of the spiral, Olmsted, Kansas. What they discovered was not ruins, it was architecture. Beneath the town, beneath the fields, beneath the bedrock. Carved into subterranean stone were 4 deep chambers arranged in a square. Each chamber held an ossuary filled not with bones but teeth, thousands of children's teeth. Carbon dating put some at over 900 years old, others modern, recent. Some had fillings from the 1980s, braces, crowns. Each chamber had a symbol carved above the threshold, the same spiral the 4 had drawn since childhood. And then, the central chamber, the 5th room, its door sealed in red wax, and scripture not from any known religious tradition, but resembling a language seen only in sleep paralysis visions. A language that scores of unrelated people across centuries had spoken while seizing, screaming, or dying. It was not translatable, but the structure it formed translated as one thing. This is where the spiral ends, or, depending on the angle of the glyph, this is where the spiral begins. There is no final chapter, only recursion. Every 44 years, the spiral completes itself, not in paper or prophecy, but in people. The 4 are not individuals, they are functions, embedded into the psychic architecture of the American subconscious, like rot in wood that looks solid, like a hymn you never learned but still know how to hum. In 2022, an anonymous researcher from the University of Kansas, working under a falsified anthropology grant, compiled 38 verified instances across the past 2 centuries where sets of 4 boys appeared, always in rural isolation, always marked by strange cognitive tics, synchronized blinking, delayed aging, and shared hallucinations. They never lived past 18, not because they died, because they were retrieved. The file was labeled, "Witnesses to an earlier draft of the world." Within that dossier was a final photograph, grainy, colorless, dated 1878, the original case. It showed 4 boys sitting in a cornfield, looking straight into the lens. The problem? Photography wasn't accessible in that region until 1885. And the camera model in the photo, it wasn't invented until 1912. But worse than the anachronism was the 5th shape, barely visible, hunched just behind them. A figure with no face, only hands, all identical, all left. Some believe this is the entity that moves the spiral. Others say it is what the spiral protects. No government official has ever confirmed the existence of the 4. No medical database retains their genetic markers, and no living witness to their rituals survives intact, mind, body, or memory. But if you listen closely at precisely 5:34 a.m. in the silence before birdsong, you may feel it, a shift in gravity, a tremble behind your eyes, a whisper with no mouth. You have been found suitable. For what? No one knows. But in Wellington, Kansas, on an unmarked field near the ruins of the Fallings Farm house, 4 depressions in the earth remain, perfectly square, perfectly aligned. Every year on August the 9th, wildflowers grow there. Not native species, not planted, not catalogued, just there, blooming in silence, facing east, waiting. The birth records were sealed, not by the hospital, but by an external agency, unlisted, unnamed, answering to no branch of the federal government. The attending physician, Dr. Elaine Moore, vanished a week later. Her home was found empty. Inside, every mirror had been shattered inward. Her phone contained only one note, saved under drafts. They are not born. They are remembered. The 4 infants were taken, legally, swiftly, without media coverage. Each was placed with a separate host family, none of whom were permitted to speak publicly. These families were given strict rituals. The boys were to be bathed in silence, fed only warm milk after sunset, and never shown their reflections. One disobeyed. In 2024, a foster father in Wichita uploaded a TikTok video meant as a joke showing his adopted son giggling in front of a bathroom mirror. The clip was online for 7 minutes. It was shared 88,000 times. Then the boy disappeared. From his room, from the house, from every digital record. Even the original video now loops incorrectly. Frame by frame, the boy's face becomes something else. 4 faces, stitched together, smiling, not with joy, but with recognition. The host father was later found in a wheat silo, clutching his own tongue in his hand. It had been torn out at the root. Burned into his chest was a crude spiral, etched by fingernail with the words, "They have found the tone." That phrase appears in other places: old hymns, abandoned hymnal margins, graffiti inside silent churches. It is said that the tone is not a sound, but a calling frequency, a pitch that resonates only in children before language forms, a code built into the body, and when 4 of the same bloodline hear it together, they awaken. The cycle begins again. Not possession, not rebirth, replication. Each time the spiral turns, the world forgets what happened last time. But the land does not. The barns still carry the screams in their beams, the churches still pulse beneath their floors, the soil still vibrates when they walk. And now, the spiral spins faster. More twins, more sightings, more silences where there should be sound. Something is waking in Kansas. And it does not dream. It remembers. On September the 3rd, 2022, the expedition team, 11 researchers, 3 ex-military contractors, and 1 child psychologist, broke the red wax seal on the 5th room beneath Olmsted. They live-streamed the event through an encrypted private server hosted in Iceland. Only 47 verified accounts were granted access. Of those, 39 went dark within 72 hours. The footage is gone, erased from all known drives, backups, and cloud instances. But one viewer, an archivist from Romania, transcribed the audio in real time. His handwritten notes, smuggled out through analog mail, are the only record of what happened inside that final chamber. The transcript begins with silence, then footsteps, then a deep mechanical hum, rhythmic, almost biological. A voice is heard. Not human, not electronic. It doesn't speak language. It emits intonation, resonances that bypass the ear and vibrate directly in the chest cavity. The psychologist on the team, a woman named Dr. Miranda Kell, begins weeping. Not out of fear, the archivist wrote. She weeps like one who has returned to a house she forgot she was born in. Then the 4 enter. Yes, the brothers, now in their mid-40s, they had been missing for over 2 decades, declared legally dead. Yet here they were, not older, not younger, but still. They speak in unison, not words, but something beneath words, the kind of speech one feels before one understands and never fully survives understanding. They raise their hands. The hum in the room shifts. The walls ripple, not like fabric but like muscle responding to memory. Then comes the phrase, spoken clearly, in English this time, by all 4 at once. The spiral is not a place, it is a direction. And then the screaming begins. Not from the team, from beneath the floor. Voices of children, hundreds, all screaming one word in perfect synchrony. Stay. The feed cuts. No one from the scent. The expedition was seen again. The 5th room was resealed, by whom, no one knows. But in the months that followed, 4 more boys were born in Kansas, each on the same day, each underweight, each without a single hair on their body, and each with a mark behind the left ear, a small black dot surrounded by 13 lines. The spiral has turned again. What began in 1878 was not a singular anomaly, it was a pattern, and patterns are not random, they are rituals in motion. In 2009, a former DARPA psychological operations analyst named Elise Wren published a limited distribution monograph titled Mnemonic Echoes in Genomic Vessels. Only 37 physical copies were printed. All were mailed, not sold, to individuals who had reported hallucinations involving cornfields, inverted crosses, or four identical figures appearing in mirrors. Wren's thesis was grim. The four brothers were part of a recurring biological ritual embedded into humanity's timeline like a ticking parasite. Every 27 years, this ritual completes a circuit, not globally, but regionally, focusing on North America's burnt soil zones, places where history has been violently erased. The goal? To reseed what was once erased from collective memory, a time before language, where thought itself was communal and memory was shared across generations through trauma. The four were not fully human because they weren't meant to be. They were vessels, constructed from rural bloodlines left untouched by industrial cognition, families with limited written history, low mobility, and deep ancestral land ties. Why? Because such people do not think in terms of narrative. They think in cycles, and cycles are necessary for incubation. Wren's writing suggests that what incubated inside the four wasn't just consciousness. It was a template. Something ancient had created them not to act, but to instruct, to bleed forgotten architecture into the minds of those around them. Teachers, doctors, pastors, children. The infection was mimetic. One teacher reportedly developed glossolalia, a form of spirit speech, after being near the four. She drew maps of an underground temple buried beneath the Kansas fault, even though no fault line is officially recognized there. One drawing led the temple, the memory that breathes. By 2012, Elise Wren vanished. Her last known communication was sent to all 37 recipients of her monograph. It contained only one sentence: "They are not becoming human. We are becoming them." Of the 37 recipients, 11 would later be institutionalized, 6 died by suicide, and 4 went missing under circumstances involving cornfields. Every 27 years, 4 are born. But every year, more remember. And remembering is how they return. In 2007, a controversial lecture circulated online under the title "Pre-Creational Aberrance: The Children Born Before Time Knew What a Child Was." The speaker, identified only as Dr. Ira Blix, claimed that the four brothers were not anomalies, but emissaries of a failed cosmology buried beneath our own. According to Blix, the four weren't sent to destroy. They were sent to remind. But remind what exactly? Blix proposed a theory so esoteric that even fringe historians refused to cite it, that in the millennia before language, ritual, or agriculture, there existed a non-linear intelligence scattered across the Great Plains, something remembered by land but forgotten by man. The birth of the four in 1878, according to him, was not a random genetic anomaly, but an unsealing. They are not possessed, they are recipients, and the sender was not from the sky. It was from beneath. He referenced early Osage and Pawnee cosmologies, specifically oral tales never transcribed, about children with inverted shadows who stood motionless in fields until animals stopped reproducing. These tales were always ended with the same sentence, muttered in fearful reverence. And then they sang the memory into the soil. Blix claimed that what we call memory is a surface function, a way for the mind to skim the top layer of time. But there are deeper strata where experiences that should not exist are still preserved, waiting for something biological to bring them back. The four brothers were biological keys. Their brains, deformed by all scientific standards, were perfectly suited not to store new memories, but to retrieve old ones, not theirs, not even human. And they were only the first. In his final slides, Blix showed graphs tracking global birth anomalies between 1878 and 2007. There was a pattern, a pulse, every 27 years. 4 children born, always male, always within 13 miles of historic soil trauma, massacres, plagues, burned churches. He warned that another pulse was due in 2008. Then the lecture vanished, every upload deleted. Blix disappeared. No university claimed him. His email domains were deregistered within hours. But on a cold February night in 2008, 4 infants were born during a snowstorm in Ellis County, Kansas. The hospital claimed it was coincidence, but the midwife reportedly fainted after hearing them cry. "It wasn't a cry," she whispered. "It was the chant." In 2001, a private research collective based out of New Haven, Connecticut, calling themselves the Sable Concord, attempted the unthinkable, to sever the psychic resonance of the 4 brothers from modern consciousness. Using a mix of ancient exorcistic rites and classified neurointerruption devices developed in Cold War black projects, they initiated what they called Operation Stillseed. The goal was to erase all memory of the 4 from anyone who had ever been exposed, directly or indirectly. Books were burned, artifacts retrieved. An entire Kansas town, Eldridge's Rest, was bought, evacuated and razed to the ground. But the more they deleted, the stronger the presence became. One agent, Arthur Lemieux, described the failure in his final written report before taking his own life. "We have confused deletion with containment. Memory is not the prison, it is the key." Those involved began experiencing what came to be known as retrospective contamination, new memories inserted into their childhoods, now laced with elements of the 4, cornfields that never existed behind their childhood homes, drawings they don't recall making, whispered voices from people they remember but who never lived. One operative reported seeing a photograph of himself at age 10 holding hands with 4 blurred figures, each face twisted and undefined, yet somehow familiar. His childhood home had been in France. The photo was dated 1881. When confronted, he calmly stated, "Yes, that's where I first met them." He was born in 1972. The deeper the Sable Concord tried to unbind themselves from the phenomenon, the more tightly they were bound to it. Their minds were no longer their own. Their thoughts weren't just being influenced, they were being rewritten, repurposed as vessels for memory that wasn't theirs. Not memory, like we understand it, but ancestral trespass. Someone else's grief, hijab, taking someone else's body. By 2004, the project was shut down, not by order, but by collapse. All remaining members either vanished, were institutionalized, or died by self-inflicted methods involving mutilation of the eyes and tongue, the 2 organs believed to invite the 4 into present cognition. The final message left behind, scrawled on a cement wall in the ruins of Eldridge's Rest. "We buried them in 1878, but we never buried what sent them." Whatever the 4 were, they weren't alone. They were envoys. The most disturbing truth was not that the 4 existed. It was that they were never meant to exist alone. In 2015, an underground researcher using the pseudonym N.D. Hollow released a digital manuscript titled The Kansas Mandala. It theorized that each generation of the 4 was part of a ritual geometry, a living sigil enacted across decades. The births weren't just biological phenomena. They were placement points, coordinates in time and soil meant to reactivate something buried beneath linear memory. According to Hollow, the 1878 brothers weren't the beginning, they were the 3rd iteration. 2 previous cycles had already passed, 1743 and 1716, but their documentation was destroyed during early settler wars. The only remaining trace is a French missionary's diary that references les 4 bénis de l'oubli, the 4 blessed of forgetting. Forgetfulness was the key. Hollow's maps showed a terrifying symmetry. If you connect the birthplaces of each of the 4 across the last 3 known cycles, 1716, 1743, 1878, and 2008, the points form a spiraling pattern centered around a desolate, now abandoned Kansas town named Olmsted. The town does not appear on most modern maps. The U.S. Geological Survey lists Olmsted as settled in 1824, depopulated by 1902, erased by 1931. What erases a town? Nothing natural. No fires, floods, or droughts were ever recorded there. Just silence. But one surviving photograph exists. A schoolhouse from 1894, windows shattered, and the number 444 carved into the lintel, no children in sight, just a circle of chairs around a burned book, and in the foreground, a hand-scrawled phrase, "We opened it, and time bled out." Hollow claimed Olmsted wasn't erased, it was swallowed, by an idea that learned to seed itself in wombs. He referred to it only as the repetitorium, a mechanism that doesn't create life but repeats a specific life form over and over across generations to re-anchor something ancient that would otherwise be lost to time. The four brothers weren't individuals, they were iterations, a ritual template, grown to remember and activate the core beneath Olmsted. And if Hollow's pattern is right, the next spiral will reach completion in 2035. But for the spiral to close, one condition must be met. They must die in the same pattern they were born.